between the TFCA program, as well as World Heritage Sites, biosphere reserves, as well as other area-based conservation measures. So without further ado, I think Clara's taken us through the meeting rules. If you do have a question that you don't want us to miss out on, please do use the group chat to type it out there, and then we'll cover it at the end of the session. We have 3 very good presenters today to take us through the topics, and we will also be doing a full-on question and answer session at the end of the session, of the presentations. Without further ado, I think in terms of the way we're going to run the presentations is first, there will be a presentation by Mr. Bastian Bertsky. He is going to cover the World Heritage Sites and TFCAs and the linkages and the integration thereof. We then have the biosphere reserves and TFCAs, the Kruger to Canyon experience by Ms. Mary Tinker Ace. She's going to take us through that presentation, and then we have the presentation by Mr. Daniel Manovic, which is the IUCN and Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures Initiative. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for the day, which is Mr. Bastian Bertsky. Bastian currently works as a scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Espra, Italy. There he is the focal point for the Southern Africa within the EU-funded Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program, which we all know as BioPAMA. Over the past 15 years, Bastian has also been involved in the implementation of UNESCO World Heritage Convention, including in various roles at the IUCN headquarters and at the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. He is a science advisor to the IUCN's World Heritage Program and has participated in many World Heritage missions and meetings. Bastian holds an MSc in Conservation Biology from the University of Cape Town. He has contributed to over 50 publications in protected areas and World Heritage Sites, and he co-authored the recent IUCN report, Natural World Heritage in Africa. Bastian, you may take the floor, Bastian. You want to put up your presentation? More than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aruna, for the kind introduction. Let me just quickly get my presentation ready. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon out there from Northern Italy. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you about World Heritage today. Let's start with the first slide. That always makes sense. Okay, great. So World Heritage, the World Heritage Convention and Transfrontier Conservation Areas is the topic of my talk. And I hope you can see my screen now. Is that okay? Then let's get started. For those who are not so familiar with the World Heritage Convention, I have a quick introduction here for you. The convention was adopted in 1972, and the first sites were inscribed in 1978. And now around the world, we have over 1,100 cultural and natural World Heritage Sites. And with 194 member states, the convention has almost universal application across the planet. It's unique in a way in its integration of cultural and natural heritage conservation. And at the same time, it's one of the global biodiversity-related conventions. Last week, we heard about the species-based for focused CITES and CMS conventions, and World Heritage sits along the Ramsar Convention as a site-based convention with a biodiversity focus as well. Decision-making in the World Heritage Convention is by the so-called World Heritage Committee, which at any given time is made up of 21 elected delegations from the member states. There is a secretariat hosted in the UNESCO headquarters in Paris called the World Heritage Center. And from the very early days, from the start of the convention, there were 3 technical advisory bodies involved in the implementation of the convention. And these are IUCN for natural heritage, and then ICOMOS and ICROM for cultural heritage. The overall goal of the convention is to identify, conserve, and promote sites of so-called OUV, outstanding universal value. That concept is very much at the heart of the convention, and it entails three things. It builds on three different aspects that a site must fulfill to be inscribed on the World Heritage List. A site must meet at least one of the 10 World Heritage criteria, and 6 of these criteria speak to cultural values and 4 speak to natural values. But a site also has to meet conditions of integrity for natural sites, and that means that it has to fulfill a certain level of intactness. And for cultural sites, there's also the concept of authenticity that I will not go into detail here today. Last but not least, and very importantly, the convention has very strict requirements for protection and management. And that means the site also needs to have demonstrated that it's effectively protected and managed before it can be inscribed on the list. And it needs to enhance and maintain that protection and management then after inscription, of course. There are 3 main types of World Heritage sites: cultural, natural, and mixed, which means cultural and natural values are recognized as being of global significance. And then very importantly for today's presentation and the session here in this webinar series is that the convention has very specific provisions for transboundary sites and serial sites, meaning that you can have World Heritage sites crossing country boundaries. There can be 1, 2 or more countries working together on a particular nomination on the management of a site, and also there can be multiple locations in one country or across multiple countries, so-called serial sites that are recognized as a single World Heritage property. When it comes to the relationship between World Heritage sites and other protected areas, other designations, as we will be talking about today, quite often World Heritage is represented as kind of like the tip of the mountain, the best of the best, those sites of all the other categories that cross this OUV threshold and are really globally significant and maintain very, very high standards in terms of intactness, protection, and management. So many of you will have seen a graph similar to this before. Now, what does it mean to be a World Heritage site in terms of benefits? What do you get out of it if you are a World Heritage site? And there's many different things that work in some places and some places not. I've just highlighted a few here, including the support that national authorities may get at national level in terms of political and financial support for managing a site. You know, you may have access to more money from the national budget. You may have more political support for the management and conservation of a site. World Heritage status can also help with the branding and marketing as a tourism destination, of course, although at the moment in these days, that's maybe not so relevant, at least when it comes to international tourism. World Heritage status can also facilitate access to international financial and technical support. So there's a whole range of international donors that support specifically World Heritage sites and networks that, you know, deliver assistance, and I will come back to that later. The World Heritage status can facilitate in many ways also transboundary cooperation, and that has been something that has happened again and again in the past, and I will come back to that also later in my talk. World Heritage status helps to raise awareness and to mobilize resources and support to address threats to sites. And we have seen that the status can also help to protect sites and their values against extractive industries and large infrastructure projects that may be damaging. And finally, something that has happened more and has become more relevant in recent years is that also the World Heritage Convention has stepped up its effort in terms of engaging with and involving communities, local communities, and can help, if it's applied appropriately, those communities to attain rights and benefits. Now, with all that in mind, and given the global recognition of World Heritage sites, the BioPharma program at the initiative of OECM has commissioned a report last year to take a synthesis look, summary look at World Heritage in Africa and look at the progress made with the implementation of the convention, but also look at some of the prospects across the continent. And this report was launched in May. We have it available in English and French, and we'll share the links with you later today. And this report really takes a look at the very basic information you need to know about World Heritage if you're unfamiliar with the convention. and then take stock of all the existing sites across the whole continent of Africa and their current status. But it also draws together lots of material from previous UNESCO and OECM studies and analyses to highlight some of the potential options for new nominations still in Africa and the extension of existing sites. And very importantly, also it provides concise advice on how to prepare nominations and how to engage with World Heritage processes. There's two points I would like to highlight from the report that I think tell a lot about the history of World Heritage in Africa and also the current state of World Heritage in Africa. First of all, looking at the number of natural and mixed sites. We see that from the early days of the convention, there has been a steady but slow increase in the number of sites in Africa. We now have 48 natural and mixed World Heritage sites across 30 countries in Africa, and that includes 5 transboundary sites. But when we look at the whole world, we see that actually over time, there has been a much bigger and faster increase in some ways, you know, in the number of sites. And therefore, I think it's justified to say that in a way, Africa lags behind in terms of the number of sites and the increase in the number of sites 40 years after the convention really started listing sites. And then secondly, the second point is about the situation at the existing World Heritage sites, natural and mixed World Heritage sites in Africa, and that many of them don't really have a very favorable conservation outlook. And this is based on the IUCN World Heritage Outlook assessments, which are done every 3 years. And there's another one coming out later this year, hopefully. But these results here that I show, they are based on the last report published in 2017. And we see that compared to the rest of the world, there are far fewer sites in Africa with a good conservation outlook. There's many more that have significant concerns or a critical conservation outlook. And yes, many of them are not in Southern Africa or Southern Eastern Africa, but still I think it's worth noting that there are challenges with the conservation and management of these sites. Now that brings me to the question on how existing TFCA mechanisms may be able to help in addressing those two challenges. And I see a number of points here that I think are worth discussing also maybe later in the discussion here in this session. And that includes the notion that TFCA mechanisms can support the coordinated management, conservation, and promotion of World Heritage sites that are often embedded in transboundary landscapes. And that can happen through joint management committees and joint management plans that are established in the framework of TFCA agreements and TFCA management. The mechanisms can also help to facilitate and harmonize monitoring and reporting to UNESCO. They can help to integrate World Heritage sites into the wider landscape and seascape, a very important point that will, I think, be also of interest later today in the other presentations when we talk about the other designations such as biosphere reserves or other effective conservation measures that all help to integrate these core World Heritage sites into the wider landscape. And thereby also promote an ecosystem approach and ecological connectivity and resilience, which are all critical to the long-term future of these sites and their values. And finally, these existing TFCA mechanisms, they have helped in the past, and then they can help also to facilitate transboundary nominations, applications for new sites, and also extensions of existing sites. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's have a quick look at the map of Africa from this report, where we see all the natural and mixed sites indicated with little green dots and numbered. And I've highlighted 5 of these in yellow, which are the existing sites that are recognized as transboundary World Heritage sites across the continent, natural and mixed sites, that is. And in Southern Africa, we see there is the Maloti-Drakensberg Park between Lesotho and South Africa. And then, of course, there is the Mudiwatunya Victoria Falls site shared between Zimbabwe and Zambia. Sorry, I'm going to go back quickly. And then there is a number of other existing natural mixed World Heritage sites that are not inscribed as transboundary sites, but that are overlapping with SADC TFCAs. And these are here highlighted with a kind of like a brownish or orange color. And I'll come back to some of them in a minute. If we look now at the future options highlighted in the report for Southern Africa, There are those that involve existing sites that could be extended transboundary into other countries. And here we have a number of examples highlighted with this pink circle, including Isimangaliso Wetland Park, the lake called Lake Malawi in Malawi that is currently a national site but could be extended into the neighboring countries, or the Okavango Delta, which was a major success story when it was inscribed a few years ago, but currently only includes the delta itself really in Botswana. And then we have areas where there is still scope for completely new nominations, transboundary nominations, such as the succulent Karoo shared between South Africa and Namibia, and also the Mozambique Channel as a marine area. I'm going to quickly go through two examples that I think we will be picking up maybe again on Thursday. And one is the Maloti-Drakensberg Park, which, as I said, is a transboundary site now, inscribed as a mixed site for both cultural and natural values, but started as a site inscribed only in South Africa in 2000. And at that time, IUCN already noted in its evaluation report that there should be potential for this to be extended into Lesotho. But at that time, Lesotho wasn't a member state of the convention. A year later, the Drakensberg Maloti TFCA agreement was signed, and 2 years later, Lesotho joined the World Heritage Convention. That paved, in a way, the way for those two countries to work together, to work towards the transboundary extension, which eventually happened in 2013. So a real success story. And that joint work continues to this day, and there have been many other initiatives taken since in the management and conservation of that area. And then another example is the Lubombo TFCA shared by Eswatini, Mozambique, and South Africa, where we have actually two natural World Heritage Sites within that TFCA, the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, which was originally inscribed in 1999, and then the Barberton Makunjwa Mountains in South Africa. Sorry, excuse my pronunciation there. And in both cases, UNESCO noted at the time of the inscription that there is potential for transboundary extensions. Meanwhile, in 2001, the Lubombo TFCA agreement was signed, and of course, the three countries cooperate in this TFCA. So the big question for me is, to what extent the existing TFCA mechanisms can help making these transboundary extensions happy. And I know there's work underway, and that's something that maybe also on Thursday in the roundtable discussion with experts from Maloti-Drakensberg and the Lubombo TFCA, we can take up. And I would be interested to explore that, where they are with this work. Now, Aruna, the chair of today's session, she had asked me in the preparatory call we had last week to also quickly highlight some of the assistance that is available to countries working on World Heritage in the region. And I just want to quickly summarize some of these sources of technical, financial advice and support that may be of interest. There is a so-called upstream process where the World Heritage Center and the advisory bodies can advise and support countries in early work on potential nominations. And that has been used, for example, in the case of the Namib Sansi, which was inscribed a few years ago. There's also the UNESCO World Heritage Fund that provides international assistance, for example, for new nominations or preparatory work, like feasibility studies for new nominations. The African World Heritage Fund has supported a lot of capacity building across the region over the last decade and supported the identification of potential sites and also the preparation of nominations. And then there are partners such as IUCN as an advisory body and its World Commission on Protected Areas. They also provide advice and support on all World Heritage matters. Last but not least, there are, of course, other donors and NGOs that are also assisting. And with all of this, I think there is a lot of potential support for countries that need this, and for also the work that I highlighted before, where there is still potential for new nominations, but also for enhancing management and conservation of sites. Now, this brings me also back to BioPAMA, this Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program that we are implementing together with IUCN as an initiative of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states funded by the European Union. And within BioPAMA, we have four main pillars. One is the Regional Resource Hub we are developing in cooperation with RCMD, an organization based in Nairobi, and all the Eastern and Southern African states. And that includes already the TFCA portal that many of you will be familiar with. and then also a regional reference information system to be hosted in that resource hub, as well as all the capacity building activities we have been running over the last 8 years and we will continue to run over the coming years. And finally, the action component, the grant mechanism of BioPharma. And in all of these different activities, we have World Heritage in mind. We want to keep World Heritage in mind, and we have options to support this type of work in the region. So one of the important things, I think, for IUCN and for me, for us at JRC, to get out of this session today and the follow-up would be to hear from you in this community of SADC TFCA practitioners and experts. What are you doing on World Heritage? What are the plans on World Heritage in the region? What are the things that you struggle with, the challenges, but what are also the opportunities, and how can BioPharma help you? We would very much encourage you to get in touch with us. And I've listed a few emails here below, but we will also follow up with an email to the whole network, that you get in touch with us. You let us know what kind of support BioPharma can provide in terms of specific capacity building or additional knowledge products and other resources, also electronic resources. And we would like to know who are the contacts and champions in the SADC TFCA network that we can follow up with and maybe create a group. And that brings me to my last slide. Just to sum up, I think it's worth keeping in mind that the World Heritage Convention is probably the most prestigious site-based MEA for natural and cultural heritage conservation. It has these special provisions for transboundary and serial sites and favors large, intact and globally significant protected and conserved areas, which fits well with the TFCA approach. There's already a good degree of overlap with SADC TFCAs, and there's also potential still for new nominations and extensions involving SADC TFCAs. And IUCN and BioPharma and our partners are very keen to follow up with you and to support your work in this area. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand over back to Aruna. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bastian, for that very good presentation. And I'm sure colleagues took note of the last few slides, which also then gives us an opportunity to link up with the colleagues and maybe also look at other options of funding, etc. Thank you very much. And I think the presentation will be made available as well, Clara, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, we will get clarity on that as soon as possible and let you know. Colleagues, without any further delay, we have presentation by Mary Tinker Ace on the UNESCO Biosphere Reserves and TFCAs, the Kruger to Canyon experience. Mary Tinker is going to come up next, and she holds a master's degree from the University of Witwatersrand and postgraduate diplomas in business management and climate change adaptation from the University of Cape Town. She's been working for the last 20 years with the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Region nonprofit company, and is since 2011 the Kruger to Canyons Biosphere Coordinator. Mary, you have the floor. You're more than welcome to come on board and do your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a big privilege to be here today. I do struggle a little bit here. Can you see my screen, perhaps?
Yes, we can see your screen, Mary. You
so
are
much.
visible. Thank you.
There we go. I'm going to go into slideshow. So while Bastian has presented to you the Rolls Royce of the designations, I'm coming in a little bit with my bucky. I don't know if everybody knows, but the pickup that's doing the work on the ground. So we're a little bit about implementation. So what I would like to do is just to tell you what a biosphere designation is all about. What is the commonalities with the TFCA designation? And then I'm going to share our implementation model and where we see ourselves as a node of the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. Then a little bit learning around collective impact, and then what a future holds for us all in our different landscapes. So the aim of UNESCO's MAP program is to reconcile biodiversity conservation with sustainable use of natural resources. The sites are listed in the world network of biosphere reserves, and of course they remain under the jurisdiction of the states and are organized into regional networks in order to improve networking and collaboration. All the sites in the world network have three complementary functions: that of conservation, sustainable development, and then a third function that's got to do with logistic support, meaning promotion of research, monitoring, education, and training. So at the moment, there are 701 biosphere reserves in 124 countries. In our SADC countries, there are 15, and 10 of them are actually in South Africa, in 5 countries. There's 2 in Malawi, 1 in Mozambique, and 1 in Zimbabwe. So we in Africa is part of the AfriMap, and at the moment, South Africa, where the National Department of Environmental Affairs is the focal point, and they are the current coordinator of the Southern Africa sub-regional network. In South Africa, biospheres is not legislated. It's implemented through a soft law approach or spirit, through collaboration between the biosphere management entities and major stakeholders. And our implementation, and you'll see my presentation is very much orientated toward implementation, is guided by the National Strategy for Biosphere Reserve. And this strategy specifically notes the value of partnerships at multiple scales. So again, biospheres, the three complementary function: conservation, sustainable development, and logistical support. And then our understanding is TFCAs take conservation of biodiversity across state boundaries, and then also have the welfare of socioeconomic development of rural communities at heart. So this was actually documented in the Greater Limpopo TFCA in the Integrated Livelihood Diversification Strategy already in 2016. And where we were noted or as note 5 in the landscapes. And I'm just quickly going to reflect ourselves again in 3 in our landscape. We have a savanna biome, we have the grasslands on top of the mountains and the Afromontane. Again, conservation of biodiversity, sustainable development and the logistics. But then very importantly, is the zonation in a biosphere. And I think other sites also deal with zonation, and the core areas where the core strong protection is happening is then, in our case in South Africa, our national park, the Kruger National Park, but also the Blyde Nature Reserve. There's buffer zones in our zonation plan, and then the transition zone is where we work, farm, have our settlements. A biosphere also deliver the following communications messages, and this is really to inspire people to work and live with the environment, in recognition of the environment. Very importantly for us in Africa as well is to make sure we all belong, and then to empower people to do what they need to do. So the partnering aspect is very important for us. And in short, this is then for us both these designations. And I think even for Bastian's designation, it's about connecting biodiversity conservation with the sustainable development of our people. In our cases, we need partners to implement projects. So projects are very important, and we are implementing at the moment with a diverse lot of partners, from government agencies to international agencies, in our landscape 10 projects. None of this is done alone. So we sort of developed a core team at our offices and have very good monitoring, evaluation, reporting and learning systems in place, which enable us then to report to our national department so they can connect to UNESCO, or report to UNESCO, where are we tracking in terms of the international requirements to have a biosphere region designation. So the collective impact approach is very, very important, because no single organization can solve any major socio-ecological problems at scale by itself. So this approach has been developed at the Stanford Social Innovation Center, and they sort of listed the conditions for collective success. And that is that you need to have a common agenda, shared measure systems, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and then very importantly, a backbone support organization. So the collective impact is the implementation side of systems thinking. I think we've heard our webinars, so how important these systems thinking approaches are. Systems thinking look at technical components of a system, while collective impact is where all the partners involved with the system get together and decide to put their agendas aside and address the system's shortcomings by binding into a collective vision. And I think that is what we want to demonstrate today, how the TFCA and the biospheres have this common vision of biodiversity conservation, reconciling it with sustainable development. So in our landscape, many organizations did very good foundational work on socio-ecological systems, and this empowers us all to look at the implementation side that we've already looked at, and that is to build a common agenda, have commitment to shared instruments, and implementing reinforcing activities, and then the common continuous communication and co-learning, and ensuring backbone support mechanisms. So what I'm going to show you just quickly now is how this has been working in our context with the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program that we've been working on since 2018, where both biospheres in the Greater Limpopo TFCA landscape, ourselves and the Wembe biosphere, are very much part of while we were deploying this collective impact approach. So it's quite a big stage now for us, just going into September, where we will be presenting the program to the minister for further implementation for 2021 afterwards. But I would quickly just reflect and also on the goal of this program, because that's very much where our biospheres are packaged in, as well as the TFCA. And this is to build strategic partnerships between communities and the conservation sector to facilitate economic transformation and job creation by conserving and enhancing the integrity of natural ecosystems in the Greater Kruger landscape. So there's in the framework, 6 goals, strategic objectives. And again, at the top, to secure the natural capital base, we were talking about conservation of biodiversity, and then sustainable development, increasing employment, but it's further then unpacked in the integrated land use management and planning, and in the supporting partnerships to mobilize resources and optimize investments, and then to strengthen data acknowledgement by doing synthesis and to support implementation. Just quickly, then the spatial layers reflects to the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area, where we have different municipalities and district municipalities embedded. Remember, in South Africa, we have a wall-to-wall policy for local government, where there are cooperation zones and then clusters, but in the end, it's all about having the biodiversity implementation clusters. And there are 7 of those, where the Bembe biosphere is in the north, and then the K2C is very much focused in our landscape on the escarpment area, but also the node around the private nature reserves, who is quite a driver for the biodiversity, a biodiversity economy implementation nodes. So what I've tried to do is just quickly is to explain the designation for biospheres through the UNESCO's MAP program. I highlighted the common ground with the TFCA designation. I shared with you how we are quite on the ground doing project implementation with partners, very importantly with partners. The K2C can't do it alone. So I reflected with you on the collective impact approach and demonstrated how collective impact is practiced, how the Greater Kruger Strategic Development Program is gearing up to support the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was right on time. I think you've done well with time. Thank you very much. Colleagues, our next presenter is Daniel Marnovic. He is Regional Conservation Program Manager. Daniel has over 20 years of professional experience leadership in the conservation sector. And Daniel's understanding of the South African, and global conservation landscapes comes with a wealth of authority on a range of integrated fields, including habitat protection and management, spatial prioritization, area-based conservation, grassroots engagement, community development, strategic conservation planning, integration with national priorities, and multilateral environmental agreements. He sits on a number of national and international committees regarding area-based conservation. Daniel's current national and global focal areas include area-based conservation targets, Aichi Target 11, key biodiversity areas, and other effective area-based conservation measures and privately protected areas. Daniel's going to take us through the presentation on other effective area-based conservation measures. And I must mention, yes, Daniel's from BirdLife South Africa. Daniel, you have the floor. I see your presentation's up already.
Great. Thank you, Aruna, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present on OECMs. As mentioned, I'm from BirdLife South Africa and very much involved in a number of IUCN commissions, but particularly the World Commission on Protected Areas. And today I'm going to present to you on other effective area-based conservation measures and how they could work in TFCA landscapes, the benefits and challenges that they bring. And this is a fairly new standard, so don't be surprised if you haven't heard about it yet. Just trying to get the slides to change. Okay, there we go. I'm going to start off with presenting or explaining what OECMs are and where they come from. And the origins of OECMs can be found in the Convention on Biological Diversity's 10-year biodiversity strategy for 2011 to 2020, which is made up of 20 targets. And Aichi Target 11 is the area-based target, which talks about conserving at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas that are particularly important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, and that's just important to note, but that these are conserved through effectively and equitably managed and representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. So it was kind of hidden in this target in lower caps, and for a while people didn't really pay it attention or ask what it is. But it's really important, and OECMs are likely also going to feature in the inheritor area-based target in the CBD's post-2020 biodiversity framework. So it's here to stay. As I said, it sat there for a while, and then in 2018, the CBD provided us with a very clear definition of what an OECM is that was adopted at the COP in Egypt. And you can see the definition in front of you. Essentially, an OECM is a geographically defined area that is not a protected area, but which is nonetheless governed and managed in ways that achieve this positive and sustained long-term outcome for in situ conservation of biodiversity, and then recognizing associated ecosystem functions and services and cultural and spiritual and socioeconomic and other values. And I've just bolded those words, those key characteristics of an OECM, which I'll work through a little bit more in more detail now. But that is the accepted definition of an OECM. There are a number of other documents that have been developed since then. So we've got the CBD definition. The IUCN have also published technical guidelines on recognizing and reporting OECMs, which further unpacks this definition. And then we are in the process of publishing a site-level methodology for identifying OECMs, which hopefully the IUCN will publish a bit later this year, but which is available in draft. But essentially what we have now is a structured framework, but with flexible indicators, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But just to briefly unpack the key characteristics of an OECM, first, it needs to have biodiversity value. And this is really because of where it originates in Target 11, which is specific about conserving sites that have important biodiversity value. So an OECM has to have biodiversity value, and that biodiversity has to be conserved in situ. The site also needs to be geographically defined, so there need to be some clear boundaries that are preferably mapped or agreed, and the size of the OECM needs to be suitable for the conservation of the biodiversity value, or at least function within a landscape of conservation and protected areas that are suitable for conserving that biodiversity. The boundary can be three-dimensional, and it can cross over terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine realms. Then the site needs to be governed. So the governance authority needs to be legitimate, and it needs to be recognized. And really important here is that it needs to be structured in a way or supported in a way that ensures it's going to be sustained into the long term. So this can't be a loose agreement or a loose understanding. There needs to be something in place that underpins the governance, such as a trust deed, a piece of legislation, contract law, agreements that bind of the authority, just something that can be shown that governance will persist and is strong. Then there needs to be active management at the site. So where a protected area would have conservation as a primary management objective, with an OECM, conservation can be a primary objective, but in most cases we will find that conservation is in fact a secondary management objective, or even an ancillary outcome of management. As long as we can draw the link between the management activities and the conservation outcomes. That's really the important part. And there needs to be some sort of management plan in place which is being implemented. Then lastly, while governance and management is your input, the effective conservation is really the output at the site, and this is what we want to recognize at the end of the day. So your governance and your management need to be effective in a way that it continues to conserve that biodiversity value at the site within its natural system, its natural habitat. And effective also means that we're able to mitigate or manage any potential internal or external threats to the site. Yeah, as I said, that there's a management plan in place, ultimately, and the ability for the site to, one, monitor its biodiversity and audit its management and governance. So there are just a couple of key principles I wanted to highlight again on OECMs that I think are really important to keep in mind. Firstly, this is a global framework, and it's aimed to recognize and report on existing conservation measures. So this is not a safeguard measure in itself, but it's really a framework we can use to recognize what's already existing in the landscape and to measure that. Recognizing and reporting OECMs requires landowner consent, so this isn't just merely a mapping exercise. There is some onus on the landowner to commit to continuing with the governance and management, and so they need to approve and consent to being recognized as an OECM. Yeah, it's really important is that the governance and management need to be in effect, need to be sustained in order to ensure the long-term conservation outputs. This is a structured framework, but really is there to accommodate the variability in the landscape, so as flexible indicators. And again, just to say that OECMs cannot be protected areas or in protected areas, so they cannot be designated or recognized as protected areas. There are obviously a number of challenges and risks with this. So this is a fairly new definition. There are a number of supporting documents that have just come out, but they're also coming out towards the end of the current biodiversity strategy, where countries need to report on how well they've met Target 11. So there are a couple of challenges we face. First is that as of yet, there's no well-defined external review process. However, the IUCN is working on this. So hopefully later this year, we'll have a better understanding of how OECMs are reviewed before they're reported. There's a risk that countries may try and fast-track recognizing OECMs in order to meet their 2020 targets. And in that, they may report inappropriate sites that are either where the habitat's degraded or the site lacks biodiversity. We may see some sectors try and push the limits of the definition of an OECM in order to recognize their sectoral practices. And then lastly, we don't want to confuse area-based conservation with sustainable sectoral practices, such as mitigating impacts on the environment versus delivering area-based conservation. However, there are a number of solutions and support out there for this process. So first, there's the CBD definition, there's the IUCN technical guidelines, and there's the site-level methodology for identifying OECMs. The IUCN is also commissioning the development of training materials, and there are already a number of training providers in our region, BirdLife South Africa being one of them, supported by the OECM task force. But UNEP WCMC, in partnership with BioPharma, are also delivering on OECM training in the region. So there's a fair level of support for the region. There's also a number of country studies and examples that we can draw from. South Africa undertook a fairly big national review of potential OECMs, which led to the development of this global methodology. I'm supporting a process in Eswatini for them to identify their OECMs. Canada's done a lot of work on marine OECMs, as have Guernsey. We'll be developing some short films to showcase the OECMs in South Africa. And all of this material is going to be showcased at the IUCN's World Conservation WCC next year, 2021. And then lastly, there's a lot of support in our region to assist countries to institutionalize OECMs into their policy and practice space. And I'll get into that a bit further. But just to quickly give you a glimpse of what the OECM assessment methodology looks like, and you can download this from the IUCN's webpage, the current draft for you to look at and comment on. It's divided into 3 steps. So the first is to support countries to do a screening of the potential OECMs in their country or in a landscape. Second is just providing details on the site and getting the consent to the landowner. And then lastly is step 3 is about taking a site through the full assessment, which consists of 6 characteristics and 21 criteria questions to assess whether the site meets all of the 6 characteristics in the OECM definition. But grading is designed in a way that really recognizes the variability in the landscape, accommodates this variability, but also is designed to assist sites improve management or governance so that they can be recognized as OECM. So it's also about taking them on a journey. Then a part that I feel really passionate about and something I feel addresses some of the challenges we could face is helping countries institutionalize OECMs. And in South Africa, we divided this into sort of 3 pillars. The first is working with governments to institutionalize this into their policy space. They will largely be the ones reporting on OECMs, and so it's important to understand how this is placed within their policy space. There are oftentimes already a community of practice around conservation areas, so it's really important that OECMs aren't seen to bulldoze in and take this over or replace it, but rather to come in and align with existing community of practice where conservation areas are concerned. And then lastly is looking at how OECMs can enhance the landscape, particularly around leveraging financial and resource opportunities. Because this is a global currency, a global framework, it addresses a lot of concerns around governance and management. It gives us a standard to which to work. So addressing those concerns will hopefully unlock more financing and resourcing, but it could also support economic activities such as those around the wildlife economy. And I'm just going to quickly touch on 3 examples. The first one is the South African case study that we undertook in partnership with national government and Kruger Canyons. And Kruger Canyons helped us do the site level assessments in the Kruger Canyons Biosphere Reserve, as you can see in this map. And this just really demonstrates how well it can work in these types of landscapes. Here we have a TFCA overlaid with a biosphere reserve, which are really large landscape level recognition. And what OECMs allow us to do is to drill down into those conservation areas outside of the core protected areas and start assessing a site by site which could be recognized as OECMs against a global standard. And you can see, based on the 9 site assessments, that 6 would qualify as OECMs, which is a rather large chunk of that landscape. This is the Kaza TFCA, and really here, OECMs could play quite a critical role in assisting with the development of the wildlife dispersal areas. So this is just a nice example of where key biodiversity areas and OECMs can work hand in hand with helping with spatial prioritization, as well as using a standardized global framework to start recognizing those conservation areas on the ground, really delivering area-based conservation. And then the last example is Eswatini, who I'm assisting recognize their OECMs. They're near the end of the process, but I've taken them through all the stages along with a national consultant, firstly to look at how OECMs align with national policy, and then with a community of practice. So we identified potential OECMs, and now it's about going and assessing those in the landscape. I think quite an important lesson here is oftentimes we think we know what's happening on the ground, and then when we get to the site and start assessing them as OECMs, we realize that in fact the picture looks very different at ground level. But again, the opportunity here is the Lumbombo TFCA and the Lumbombo Biosphere Reserve, where we know we could have some nice low-hanging fruits to identify OECMs. So in concluding, there are a number of benefits for countries to take on recognizing OECMs and assessing them in the landscape. Firstly, the structured framework provides a formal and rigorous recognition of conservation areas in the landscape. It's designed to support existing conservation area frameworks that are being used by countries. Obviously, it helps countries report on Target 11 and whatever the post-2020 targets will look like. OECMs, and something to keep in mind is, while the current target in Target 11 speaks about 17%, we are likely to look at a post-2020 target of 30%. So the target's going to be a lot higher. And I think ideally where we want to find these targets are in these sustainable landscapes that TFCAs offer us. And OECM's offering is that it helps develop a mosaic of OECMs and protected areas, and improves the connectivity between those protected areas and buffers using a global standard. And lastly, that these sites could act as stepping stones to maybe becoming protected areas later down, or privately protected areas later down the road. But the flexibility really allows us to design a more inclusive area-based conservation, where we can accommodate these less formal structures that have previously not been recognized for their conservation efforts. It also helps motivate improvement, So particularly where governance is falling a bit short or management is, we can help bring them up to a global standard. We can work within sectors. So for instance, the game farming or wildlife sector, to help them improve their practices. For instance, in South Africa, we hope to support the development of wildlife ranching certification scheme using the OECM framework. And lastly, the wildlife economy, where we want to bring communities into the economy. OECMs can really underpin those communities' governance and management structures, give us a very clear idea that they meet a certain standard before investing in them and pulling them into a wildlife economy. So that's the end of my presentation, and really just to leave you with a final thought here, that in a transnational conservation landscape, OECMs provide a global currency for assessing, recognizing, and reporting area-based conservation, but can also create sustainable and connected conservation landscapes and underpin the cooperative management and wildlife economies, and really complements designations like heritage sites and biosphere reserves and TFCAs by drilling through all of those and giving site-by-site recognition for their conservation effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Much appreciated, very detailed presentation. And all the presenters, thank you very much. We've tried our best to keep in the time limits, but we are sitting now at 4 o'clock. And I think we will be opening the question and answer session. So colleagues, we're going to open the floor for questions verbally and written that Clara's going to help me with those that I've not seen that have been written, and anything else as well in terms of inputs or clarity or comments are also welcome. So we are going to have an open session now. Yeah, the floor is open. Please feel free to pick up your hand so I can recognize you before you speak, and then you introduce yourself before you speak as well, whether it be a question or a comment or input. Thank you very much. Clara, you want to add?
I didn't want to add. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to note that there is a question for Bastian that was written down earlier on by Clive Polney. So Clive, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question directly, and then Bastian will give you an answer. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Clive.
Okay. Bastian,
go ahead.
what I'd like to know is that if a World Heritage Site has been badly managed, as in the case that I'd put into the chat box, such as Ismangaliso, what can be done about it in terms of the World Heritage Site unit that you're part of? And secondly, it obviously would have an impact on the extension of a World Heritage Site into other countries, such as through the Lubombo Transfrontier Conservation Area into Mozambique and Swaziland. And so what recourse is there to take on the authority where it is not protecting the biodiversity professionally, and secondly is excuse me, is impacting on the rights of people to do commercial developments in regulation with the World Heritage Site legislations. And there would seem to be some form of some form of corruption in terms of the way in which this is happening. How can this be prevented? Thank you.
Yeah, may I respond? Okay. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I will not comment on the specific case and the issues you raised there, but one of the good things, that I feel very strongly about in the World Heritage Convention is that it has very good monitoring and reporting procedures. And although with over 1,100 sites around the world, it's not possible every year to have a report on every site or a mission to every site. And many things also go unnoticed for too long, for some time. This particular convention, unlike some other agreements, has in fact mechanisms such as the periodic reporting process where countries report, such as the reactive monitoring process where when issues get raised by people from a country, by NGOs, by whoever contacts UNESCO or IUCN, there is correspondence between the World Heritage Center in Paris and the country to seek clarification, to seek a report. And then the outcomes of that are presented to the World Heritage Committee meeting, and the meeting can decide to request further information or to dispatch a mission to investigate the situation on the ground, which then reports back again to the next meeting, and then the meeting can also put some very strong requests to a country. And ultimately, if a site loses its values and is really badly managed, it could end up on the so-called danger list, on the list of World Heritage in danger, which unfortunately we have too many sites in Africa already on, but that's another mechanism that then results in annual reports and follow-up missions and a plan of action to be agreed between the country and the management authorities and UNESCO, for rectifying measures. So that's the big picture. Now, in the case of Isimangaliso, sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, but I just checked, and the last report that was, that looked into this, the conservation status of the site and was discussed and decided on by UNESCO, dates back 16 years, so that was 2004, which is an awful long time. And since then, there have been only some other matters that were discussed and decided on. And now, but I actually realized, in preparation for my response, that last year, some issues were raised by somebody about some management issues concerning the forest and prospective mining and so on. And exactly as I outlined before, UNESCO sent a letter to South Africa, and South Africa in December prepared a response to that letter. And if it hadn't been for the COVID crisis in June, July this year, the World Heritage Committee would have met and looked at this response and also the report from UNESCO and IUCN and adopted some draft decision, which probably could have asked South Africa to do something about something. And so there are all these processes, and of course also the operational guidelines that guide the implementation of the convention include many provisions, and guidelines for the countries on what to do, and they clearly highlight that it's the responsibility of the country to manage sites effectively, but to do so in collaboration with the communities and other stakeholders and to achieve certain standards. And if these standards are not met, everybody is invited to let IUCN and UNESCO know, and then these follow-up procedures kick in. Does that help?
That does, thank you. But I'd just like to reiterate that the point is that communities have been alienated. Part of the World Heritage status, as I understand it, would be that they would be beneficiaries because a number of people in that area were removed by the previous government with their conservation legislation. And they're not, at this point, benefiting. And that becomes a danger to the site, as well as a security threat in that entire area. And there's very little chance of an expansion of Smangaliso into a transfrontier conservation area under those circumstances. So something needs to be done. And if the South African government is not taking this seriously, it needs to be escalated to where it will be taken seriously.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, it sounds to me, just a quick response to that, it sounds to me like a case where maybe also this view of like a potential transboundary extension in the future, that it may be time to invite, some international expertise from UNESCO, from IUCN, WCPA, take a look at that and to discuss these issues with the South African stakeholders, and also, you know, with potentially the other countries involved, and to see what needs to be done, what can be done. There's lots of positive, you know, stories, success stories now we can learn from in recent years, where communities have actually been the driving engine behind World Heritage nominations, and where also legacy issues have been successfully addressed. And I think that sounds like a scenario maybe, you know, where, or a situation where maybe like this kind of international facilitation or a fresh look at this may help, and where certainly there are issues that need to be addressed. Okay,
excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Clive and Bastian. I think what we would also recommend, there's a roundtable where there'll be more discussion around Maloti and Lubombo TFCAs on Thursday. So I'm sure we can take it further then. There is another question. I think Daniel's responded. It's for Daniel from Michael Ramperi. Michael, are you happy with what Daniel's written down there? Would you like further clarity? Can I give Michael the floor? So Michael's saying that he's clear, but I think it's important for everyone who's part of this just to, Michael's question was to Daniel saying, does OECM initiative support land rehabilitation efforts, especially land, yeah, I think, oh gosh, especially land. Does OECM initiative support land rehabilitation efforts, especially land which used to be of high conservation value, or do we just concede losses? Daniel, do you want to respond to that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So interestingly, this came through when they were trying to agree on the definition for OECMs. One of the countries put in that land that's being rehabilitated could also be recognized as an OECM. This was obviously from a country that didn't have a lot of biodiversity. And the concession, I guess, in the IUCN technical guideline is that where a site meets all the other criteria, such as governance and management, but the habitat is deteriorated, but there are efforts to rehabilitate that land, then that site would be a candidate OECM. We put it on a list of candidate OECMs. And when it's at a point that it can demonstrate that that biodiversity is being rehabilitated, it then goes on and is recognized as an OECM. That's kind of how it's outlined in the technical guidelines. We're not quite sure how that's going to work at a practical level, but that's the idea. We don't want to recognize sites that say they're going to rehabilitate, and then, you know, 10 years down the line, they still haven't. But we do want to motivate them to do it.
Thank you, Daniel, for that response. Clara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Runa. I just wanted to have a question or clarification again from Daniel, but also from Maritinka, because she mentioned that they're also working on OECMs, as Daniel's presentation showed. When you say, like, you write a project around developing an OECM, for instance, like the one that has been done in KTC, who actually do you ask funding for implementation? Is it like to the national government, or to a UCN or the CBD? How does that, you know, once you've written the project, who do you give it to, and what happens? What is supposed to happen next?
Good question, Clara. I think Daniel, you go ahead first.
Okay. Thanks. I don't know if there have been too many of these types of projects. Our South African study was actually funded by the IUCN Leonardo DiCaprio because they wanted a national level assessment to kind of inform the CBD and assist other countries. You know, the project in Eswatini is funded through a UNDP GEF-funded project. Yeah, and I guess it really depends. There's a lot of potential sources out there, and it depends on the value offering at the time. But it's fairly new, and there's quite a lot of interest in OECMs because it's a global standard that can now be used. I know Maritinka is maybe developing more specific OECM type projects on the back of what we did with them in K2C.
Maritinka, you want to add?
Yes, so just, you know, we really embraced the methodology and the program and the linkages with the landowners. In our case study, it was also with communal landowners, which was a sort of a new approach that we've done the case study. So where we are at, we hope to do it more extensively, but we have written a couple of funding proposals now and haven't got, you know, with the COVID-19, we haven't got feedback yet, but we really gunning to do real implementation, still talking all the time to Daniel to get these case studies going and see what value can there be to upscale it to other sites. Does that make sense, Daniel?
Yeah, it does, Maritinka. And I think, you know, all governments are going to be pressured to recognize OECM. So there's a process around supporting them to do it properly. And I think TFCAs provide a really nice springboard to do that, with a focus on the TFCA and then upscaling that to national government. But also then the second part is around the offering. So like I mentioned, OECMs could support the development of a wildlife ranching certification scheme, or provide a platform for community engagement in the wildlife economy. So there are various offerings that OECMs provide that you could raise money for specifically.
Thank you, Daniel. So what I'm hearing is that there'll be more formalized way of approaching for funding going forward. Things are relatively new, and there will be formalized approach, but TFCAs will be used as a springboard to fast track in terms of the requirements thereof. Yeah, that's just to summarize what I'm hearing. I have a comment from Mark Carroll saying, presentations have all been first class and very informative, and he sees collaboration as being key to all of these area-based approaches. So thank you, Mark, for that. I think it's very important to take note that collaboration is definitely key when we look into, for example, Maritinka's presentation around the K2C and how those layers fit within each other and how they get to the ground level. Clara, I don't see any other comments or questions coming from my side. Do you have any that's on your side?
No, Varuna, there are no more questions, no comments from the participants.
So we've been very clear.
Yes.
Is everyone just scared, or what? It's very quiet on that side. It's like we've lost everyone.
Or maybe they're still thinking about all the opportunities that have been discussed. I mean, I was just thinking now how, you know, in developing transfrontier conservation areas, we always have this, what we call the interstitial areas, and what do we do in between protected areas? Because for protected areas, we know very much what to do. But for what happens in between, we almost don't have a real plan. You know, like we have to now start to collaborate with the local government, which in a way, historically, we see different for conservation, even though it isn't. And what the Kruger to Canyon project showed is that it takes some time, but eventually it needs to happen, that the planning that is done for a district or municipality or a province needs to align to the conservation planning and vice versa. And maybe these OECMs, because they are so fluid in a way, they provide us for a new way to think about how we bring together the formal government planning, you know, like the integrated development plans and end use planning and things like that, to the conservation planning in large landscape like those that we see in TFCAs. I mean, it's very important for complex systems like the Great Limpopo, but if I think of the Kavango Zambezi, it's almost like essential that we think of what to do, because you can't just build corridors. You know, you can't, the connectivity conservation cannot just be a protected area corridor, protected area corridor. There's so much more to it, and this provides us a good food for thought and creativity in how to move forward. Are there any experiences from the floor, like from the participants, with
For sure, Clara. I was just thinking with the OECMs, it makes it more deliberate. I think with our experience in the TFCA program, we had to basically map out the TFCA areas that form protected areas, which is your very formalized zones. And then the areas around those protected areas would then be part of the larger conservation area framework. But then the formal conservation will not be necessarily the benchmark to add areas into the TFCA. So even if there was a community wanting to add the, their property onto the TFCA, they would have to do some sort of conservation status to bring them on board. But however, being part of the broader TFCA, you don't really have to have conservation as your primary land use. So I think TFCAs in effect had the OECM's kind of approach or thinking back then. It's just now becoming more formalized and more deliberate in terms of the way forward. Yeah. So I think it's now 4:20, Clara. I wonder if it's maybe we close the session a little bit earlier, seeing that there isn't any more questions or comments. Is that allowed?
Bastian may have. He raised his hand.
I raised my
Bastian.
hand.
There we go.
I don't know how to do it in the system, so sorry.
Okay.
I just did it the old-fashioned way.
Go ahead.
I think one thing that just occurred to me, I mean, today we had these presentations and discussions on World Heritage Convention on the one hand, the UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, and also the OECMs. That reminds me that in fact it was, I think, in 2003 at the IUCN World Parks Congress in Durban when IUCN's World Heritage Program put out a bold kind of like vision for World Heritage sites around the world, where they basically said that wherever feasible, any natural World Heritage site should be embedded within a biosphere reserve, around it. And okay, we have come a long way since, and there's all these other zoning and buffering approaches. And for me, the biosphere reserve concept, and Marie Dinker really presented as well, is still very attractive. And if you look at the bigger picture, it has all the elements you need to reconcile sustainable development and biodiversity conservation. And usually World Heritage sites, they sit within that landscape. But also you have the OECMs, which cover big areas that, would probably be called buffer zones or transition zones in the biosphere reserve model. And so I think we have all these different tools and mechanisms now that can really come nicely together to have large landscape or seascape planning and management, and can achieve outcomes that previously we didn't achieve because we were working in isolation and thinking in our boxes. And if anything, I think that would be my hope, that today's session has helped a little bit also to see how, of course, all of this can work in the TFCA context and with TFCA experiences, and especially in Southern Africa, with these large landscape complexes that are already experiencing some of this and practicing some of this, and well, the rest of the world can learn from as well. And I think we have many parts of the world that don't have that experience and practice, and so something we also need to spread beyond the region.
Thank you, Bastian. We have a hand raised. I cannot recognize Clara, the person, but sir, you have the floor.
Yeah, I don't see him anymore.
There is one in the text box by Brits Meyers.
Yeah, there is a comment from Vince around integrating this kind of concept into a sort of an education system, because in his experience, he lives and works in the Venda area of the Limpopo province in South Africa. It is difficult to even explain these concepts to rural communities, let alone have them being proactive in trying to take advantage of the different tools and the solutions that are available. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that, but then we also have 2 raised hands. Hlobisile Sikosana was the person who originally had raised the hand and lost. And then Christina Kesh.
Christina Kesh.
Yeah.
I think if anyone wants to give Vince Mayer's question
sure.
a stab first. Bastian, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, it's not my field of expertise, but I know that from UNESCO, there are fantastic resources also for very basic education levels on biosphere reserves and on World Heritage sites, like up down to the level of cartoons and, you know, and very nice and attractive little maps and things like that. And my internet just broke. I mean, my browser just broke, but I will dig out the link, and there's definitely some very interesting material. And I think at that level, also it's good to discuss with students always, you know, how they map the environment around them and the different components of that, and then relate that back to some of these abstract concepts, you know, that OECMs is a tricky one still for me as well, right? But I think it's worth actually exploring these concepts and seeing also that, you know, many people will have an understanding in their own language and their own culture from their experience that relates to some of these things. And for World Heritage Sites and biosphere reserves, for sure, there are some fantastic resources from UNESCO that I will try to find.
Thank you, Bastian. I think let us give Mr. Skosana the floor to raise his question. And then Christina Kesh, and then we have one in the chat box. There's a question there, the participants having problems with the microphone. So Mr. Sikosana, I hope I said your surname correctly, sir. You may go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much. I just have a...
My apologies.
Okay. Yes, I just have 2 comments. The first one is on it's a question on the governance criteria for OECM. And I just want to know that I remember when we were considering them under the CBD, we emphasized on the flexibility to suit national circumstances. I don't know how feasible that is when it comes to practicality. So maybe we can hear some examples on how different governance systems at national level are able to fit into that criteria. Then the second aspect is the issue of synergies and also under UNESCO. But then my plea will be maybe to expand the scope in order for us to be able to pay attention to the areas that have not been really prioritized before. We know we've been having TFCAs, we know we've been having a World Heritage Sites under UNESCO at a biodiversity importance that we need to focus on. And I think this OECMs provide that opportunity for communities, which was not necessarily there in the previous instruments, to be able to showcase their conservation measures. And I think we really need to get ourselves out of the TFCA and the UNESCO boundaries and look at those areas which we might lose if we don't do anything to them. And I think OECM provide that opportunity to actually recognize those areas.
Thank you very much. I wonder if our presenters have captured. The first one was around the governance structures, and the second one, I think, Daniel, if you can just take a stab at it.
Yeah, sure. So if I could give you practical examples from the case studies we ran, assessed in Kruger Canyons, I say that 6 of the 9 sites qualified as OECMs. So the 2 that didn't were unfortunately community sites. We assessed 3 community sites. The one qualified because they had entered into an agreement with a local NGO who was assisting them to develop land use management plans around livestock and burning. And so there was an agreement in place, and there were technical skills to support them in implementing that. They also developed an additional framework or structure to support the governance and management. I think it was called the Community Development Forum, which ran parallel to the traditional authority. So that strengthened the governance. The other 2 community sites didn't have that in place. So they were purely just traditional authorities in place that oversaw governance of the community and the community's use of the natural resources. And the governance authority themselves felt that that wasn't strong enough to constitute an OECM. They didn't have the control over the land use that they would have wanted. And there wasn't really active management in place. So I think this is going to be a challenge for a lot of community sites, and we need to think carefully about how we support communities to strengthen governance as much as possible. But there are opportunities through, for instance, the wildlife economy or through market-driven certification schemes to do that. And then if I can just briefly speak to the sort of the zoning in biosphere reserves, particularly, and maybe World Heritage sites. I mean, I think that we understand that a lot of biosphere reserves have 3 zones, but the buffer zone and the transition zone haven't always been that well spatially mapped. We're not always quite sure where those boundaries are. So I think OECMs provide us an opportunity to start with that mapping and get a clear idea of where the buffer zone is, where we have active conservation outcomes, and where the transition is, where we sort of have sustainable land use in place. So it'll be a really good mapping exercise.
Thank you, Daniel. If the Ms. Sikusana can advise if you're covered, the second half of your question, are you covered? Okay, I'm not getting a response. Then can I give the floor down to Christina Kesh to put through her question? You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry, my camera or my internet is not good enough for camera. I'm working for Frankfurt Zoological Society in Zambia, but I've worked in the CASA TFCA for many years before that on carnivore connectivity. I would just have a comment to what Clara said earlier about corridors in the TFCA, and that it's not just as easy as putting up a corridor, that there's more to it, because we are dealing with a mixed land use landscape in these areas. But this is, in my mind, this is exactly the beauty about corridors, because a corridor can be anything. It doesn't, there's often an issue with the terminology when you use the word corridors, because people immediately think it must be a physically protected area, probably a fence, maybe with a buffer zone around it, all humans out, and this is the, to facilitate movement of animals. This is one extreme example of a corridor, yes, but a corridor can be anything. It can range, from that to just an area that is completely inhabited by humans, but you have some sort of management strategies, programs in place, that increase tolerance, that still have, that promote coexistence of people and animals moving through the same space and keeping both sides safe from each other, basically. So yeah, it's not a question, it's just a comment that we just always have to be careful how we use that word corridor, I think, because it's often, what it raises in people is often this hard boundary, no people, just animals allowed kind of thinking. And this is not necessarily the case. There can be all kinds of varieties of a corridor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that clarity or comment. I think you're 100% correct. I mean, corridors can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. and it's not necessarily something defined in a textbook. But when it comes to TFCAs, if you look at TFCAs, they want to create a human and wildlife movement, but obviously taking into account the rules that govern the sovereignty of the countries that are part of the TFCA as partners. So yeah, thank you for that very interesting point. May I request you to put your hand down now, Christina? I think on the chat, Clara, there was one, but I see there was a response. So if we're happy with that written response.
There were a couple of questions floating around in the chat, yes, while there were questions being answered live. So, but I think we have resolved a lot of the points with the help of other participants. So with Joyce from the Maloti-Drakensberg, who also reminded us that in different countries also have national programs to facilitate, yes, the working with communities on conservation, like the biodiversity stewardship program here in South Africa. And I think we're going to talk more about those on Thursday as well with Rapson Dlotlo, who is the international coordinator for the Maloti-Drakensberg Transfrontier program. And then Steve Collins, he also, it's something that we've been talking about for a long time, and how we keep on having, with every new designation, every new status, comes reporting, and that can be very onerous on the persons that are responsible, because not only they're now reporting to the country in terms of what the country wants to achieve, but they're reporting on what the TFCA wants to achieve, they're reporting on what the Ramsar wants to achieve, and the UNESCO, and you name it, and all they come. So I don't know if the participants would like to share some thoughts on that. Yes, Daniel, I see you have a raised hand. And also a reminder that in the Thursday session, we'll talk a little bit about these issues with one of the moderators, Jessica Stewart from the UNEP WCMC program on monitoring, who will talk about the work that they've done with BioPharma, specifically to start to help integrate all of these different reporting mechanisms. So, Chair, I don't know if you want Daniel to add more onto this.
I think we allow Daniel, and then there is another question for Daniel that just come in. So Daniel, if you can take this one, and then we'll go to the next one very quickly.
Yeah,
I want us to wrap up. Yeah.
Okay. So just to quickly address Joyce's comment, I mean, it's a really relevant comment. South Africa has a very strong community of practice around biodiversity stewardship, and three of the two bottom categories of the three are intended to recognize conservation areas in various forms. And we were very careful about working with SANBI and the biodiversity stewardship community of practice to make sure that OECMs weren't perceived as something that replaces that, but in fact rather aligns with it and supports it. And to speak to Steve's comments, one of the reasons we want to do that is because while a biodiversity agreement is something meaningful to us in South Africa, it's not something we can easily report on internationally, because they don't know what a biodiversity agreement is or what the parameters are. So if we can align them and say that a biodiversity agreement is also an OECM, we know that because of a very set framework nationally that meets the OECM criteria, we can then confidently report that as an OECM. And I think that's what we want to achieve, is we don't want to duplicate reporting, but we want to understand where the overlap is. And I'm sure Jessica will talk to that on Thursday, so that when we're reporting on biosphere reserves, we can also report on the OECMs that we know are there, which is an international currency and speaks to our reporting requirements to actually target 11 and so forth. And so I think it's really important for us to embrace these global standards, but I think there's an onus on organizations like the IUCN to unpack how these all speak to each other and complement, so that we in fact relieve the reporting burden rather than add to it, if that makes sense. And it's all about how it's framed.
Thanks, Daniel. The one potential link between OECM and biodiversity stewardship program, including the tax incentives offered. This question talks around tax incentives, and whether that will be also provided by the OECMs, just like how the Biodiversity Stewardship Program provides those tax incentives. That is the question.
Thanks. That's a good question. And the person who's been unlocking those tax incentives worked quite closely with me on the OECM project, Candace Stevens. So currently those tax incentives are only relevant to protected areas under the NEMPA. They're not relevant to the lower categories. And so there currently aren't any for OECMs. However, I am working with her to look at how we could potentially unlock financial resourcing for OECMs. And that's not clearly defined yet. It's still early days, but the idea is to see how we could use OECMs to unlock finances. And that might come through the wildlife economy, but we're still looking.
Thank you, Daniel. And just also, just on the reporting, in terms of the World Heritage Convention, for example, I think more will be covered in the session on Thursday, but just on the top of my head, it reminds me of the fact that we have used the TFCA mechanisms previously to assist with the reporting to the World Heritage Convention, as well as to deal with meeting counterparts as part of the TFCA mechanisms. So that also unlocks a lot of the duplication of reporting from the World Heritage and TFCA perspective. So that just covers something that Steve was bringing up. Colleagues, on my screen, I think we have completely exhausted the comments in the chat box, as well as the questions and the raised hands. Clara, is there a formula for closing? Comments from the presenters, maybe, and then we close? Can we do that from Bastian, then Mary Tinker, and then Daniel, and then Clara? From my side, it's been a privilege. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It has been quite an experience, and I really thank the organizers for this wonderful, brilliant series of webinars that have been taking place every week. I think we're all going to miss it. From next week, reprioritizing our Tuesdays and Thursdays just to make sure we're part of this. Thank you very much. Bastian, a few words from your side?
Sure, yeah, difficult to add to that. No, it's been a fantastic journey, I think, for everyone. I missed some of the webinars, but make sure that I will watch the recordings. It's been great today. It's been a privilege to be part of this group. I think we covered a lot of ground. For me, TFCAs are still kind of like something that I learn about new things all the time, and I'm looking forward to explore further some of these synergies between the different designations and the TFCA context in Southern Africa and beyond. I mean, because I think TFCAs, they also, of course, exist and gain traction in other parts of the world. And if anybody has, again, I reiterate the request, if anybody works in the field of World Heritage or is interested to know more or more support also from the BioPharma program, please get in touch. We will follow up with an email and make sure that both the TFCA voices and also those World Heritage voices are heard and are responded to. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you also for the wonderful opportunity, not just for today, but for the past 9 weeks. And I'm looking forward to Thursday. And Lisa and Clara, we're going to all sing to you on Thursday.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to share a story, I was last year in London where they were discussing this post-2020 framework and some of the ideals, and on the area-based target, people were talking about 17% was too low, we need 30%. Some people were advocating for 50%. The science says we need 70%, which was massive. But what people were talking about is if we want to meet these ambitious targets, we need to think about sustainable landscapes, multiple use sustainable landscapes. And the first thing that came to mind for me were TFCAs. And I've been out of TFCAs for a while. I was here 20 years ago and left, and now I'm back, jumping back into this space. And I still find it extremely exciting. I know these webinars have been about sharing 20 years worth of experience, and people who have been here for the full 20 years are probably, you know, they see the frustrations and the opportunities. I'm lucky I only see the opportunities. But it's a very exciting space. And as I've said, I think it's a great springboard to launch things like OECMs and to reconcile a lot of these types of international frameworks. So thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been, and Clara?
Thank you, everybody, for today and for the effort that you put in for your presentations, for your remarks and your ability to tackle the questions, sometimes difficult, that were asked from the audience as we start a new journey of more collaboration and more integration. Like you all, I would like to invite you and our audience to attend the very last session on Thursday, in which we will talk about what does it mean in practice to work within a TFCA space that also has other designations. So as we have anticipated, there will be the coordinator of the Maloti-Drakensberg Transfrontier program, and then a focal point from Eswatini for the Lubombo TFCA, which spans 3 countries, and it's truly sort of bush to coastline TFCA. And then we will have the Vembe Biosphere Reserve as well. So we'll look at how integration can and does happen. And then we'll also talk about the integration with national designations like we have, for instance, in South Africa. So I say goodbye, but I also say I'll see you again on Thursday. For all of those of you who can readjust their schedule for the last time, hopefully you do. You must register again online and enjoy the rest of your day. And if you want, you're welcome to open your video, open your microphone, and say goodbye and thank you to your presenters and the chat today. Thank you, Arina. Everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Appreciate it again.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Enjoy the rest of your day.